All right, let's hear it for Christian, everybody.
How we doing, folks? Everyone can see me okay? Everyone can hear me?
Yep.
Yeah? Getting shuffled around? So I can pretty much start whenever, right?
Yeah, you're starting.
All right, great. So, my name is Christian Perez. I am the host of a podcast called Modernity and Absurdity. Still thinking about the name. Don't know if I love it. It's only been about 2 years. I real quick want to thank everybody for being here. Want to thank everybody for coming out. I want to thank everybody who's following online. I thank you. I want to thank Brian and Heather for the platform. I've been doing a lot of work here, and I'm appreciative to be able to be here to talk to you. So what I'm going to talk about tonight, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a primer on conspiracy theories. And where's Heather? Initially she was like, I thought you were going to talk about aliens. I'm definitely not going to talk about aliens. That's about it. Maybe next time if there's enough people that want it, I'll talk about aliens. But I am going to give a quick primer on conspiracy theories. I do lecture on them at Brookdale Community College. I teach a non-credited class on them. So the first thing I'm going to start off with is a couple definitions. The first definition I want to give you is just that of a conspiracy. I think any one of us, if I asked you to define a conspiracy, you could all pretty much come up with it in your head. You can give me an example, right? And the idea would be it's a secret plan by an individual or a group to seize power or resources, right? That's something we could all pretty much agree on. Before I start, though, what I really want to say, and I want to just beat this home, is that conspiracies are real. They do happen. Right? We could look at the assassination of Julius Caesar, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and we could see, yes, conspiracies are real. They do drive history. I'm sorry, they do impact history. They don't drive history. That's the whole point of my presentation. But we have conspiracies, right? So what differentiates a conspiracy theory from a conspiracy? Well, a conspiracy theory is the belief that major phenomena or world events are actually the result of conspiracy. So we could look at the moon landing, we could look at 9/11, we could look at the Boston Marathon bombing. And to ask a conspiracy theorist, they would say, well, look, there were people in a room, very X-Files, if any of us ever watched X-Files, the idea is always, a bunch of dudes in a room, it's usually a bunch of old men, usually a bunch of old white men, dimly lit, and they're pulling the strings for everybody all over the world. We know in reality that's not how power works. We know that industries rise and fall. We know that power is spread out among millions of individuals, businesses, families, and so on and so forth. So this idea that there's a small cabal of people, you can call them the NWO, you can call them the Illuminati, or all these blatantly racist and anti-Semitic theories about them. But there's this idea that they're pulling the strings, and that's not necessarily the case. The third definition I'm going to give you is the phrase conspiracism, and that's just the belief in conspiracy theories, right? It's also known as conspiratorial thinking or the paranoid style. There's a really great author and a really great article called The Paranoid Style in American Politics, written in 1964, Harper's Weekly. This guy Hofstadter, he talks about conspiracy theories that are prevalent at the time in 1964, and he gives a history from the inception of the United States. And if you read that article, The Paranoid Style in American Politics, it is probably more relevant in 2019 than it was in 1964. We are living in the age of social media, the age of the internet. So that time where conspiracy theorists would kind of like communicate through magazine articles and so on and so forth, they could do it in real time now. So what I'm going to do next is just rattle off some of the more ubiquitous conspiracy theories. I'm sure you've heard of some of them. You've got the anti-vaxxers, Jade Helm 15. We've all heard of the flat earthers, right? You've got some more prominent celebrities kind of coming out and saying they're flat earthers, and that's not good. JFK assassination, that's a biggie. Somewhere upwards of 70% of Americans believe that was an actual conspiracy. 9/11 truthers, chemtrails, and so on and so forth. We'll talk about that some other time. But of course, there are the more despicable conspiracy theories, right? Like I told Heather, I'm not going to talk about aliens, right? There are the more despicable conspiracy theories. The ones I'm sure we've all heard, the ones that target Jews, the ones that target Muslims, the ones that target Black people and Latinos, or even the so-called gay agenda. I'm sure all of us have heard that phrase. That's a conspiracy theory, right? This idea that gay people, a handful of gay men and women, are just sitting in a room plotting on how to impose homosexuality and being gay on the rest of the population. And we'll laugh about that, and we may think it's silly because we are progressives. We do have a better understanding of history and politics. But the reality is people out there do believe these things. They do believe these ideas. As progressives, it's very easy for us to look at these people and roll our eyes, and that's unfortunate. This week, I actually released 2 episodes of my podcast. It was a 2-for week, and the episode that I published last night was with a really good guest. Her name was Tanzim, and she talked about her own intellectual and political growth and how she came of age politically very much like I did in the age of George W. Bush, and she came from the inner city, and she was very much exposed to conspiracy theories early on. And there was a time, a couple of years ago, as she was really maturing intellectually, where she went to a meeting with a bunch of anti-capitalists, a bunch of left-leaning progressives, and she kind of came at them with this conspiracy theory stuff, and they laughed at her, and they mocked her, and it was a wasted opportunity at a teachable moment. Now, thankfully for her, she was able to come full circle. She's a graduate student at CUNY. She's kicking butt. She's doing great. That story is something that happens a lot. Conspiracy theorists know that something is up, and it's our job as progressives, hopefully those of us that are anti-capitalist, to kind of seize on them and explain to them how the world really works. But some people are going to ask me, Christian, what's the harm? What's the harm with just believing things that aren't necessarily true? Right? I can give you a couple examples. Right? The first example would be June 1st, 2015. A white supremacist walked into a church in Charleston, South Carolina, and he murdered 9 people in cold blood. Right? When asked why he did it by one of his victims, he said, "Y'all are raping and killing our women. You're going to take over the world." Really quick, stop and think. Can anybody name, this is more of a rhetorical question, but think of how many industries or institutions in this country are actually run by people of color. When you ask yourself what institutional and industrial power people of color have, it's not as great and as vast as you would think. What industries or institutions are there where white people don't ultimately have a say? So this idea, that this myth that has been perpetuated since the inception of the United States, that black people, or in particular, and people of color in general, are just this ravenous group of people coming to steal white women and white wealth. The second example I would give you comes from this past year, 2018. Another white supremacist, another anti-Semite, walked into the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, and he executed 11 people. His reason was that he believed that Jews, again, now anti-Semitism is the backbone of Western conspiracy theories, but he walked in there believing that there were Jews who were orchestrating an invasion on the United States using Central American migrants as proxies, right? This idea that Jews, the Jews, this amorphous idea of Jews that they're paying these migrants to come to this country and do whatever it is they're supposed to do, rape, steal, bring drugs and crime, and so on and so forth. So white supremacy in itself is a conspiracy theory because it's based on this idea and this false notion that people of color, it's based on a couple of false notions, but that people of color were just ravenous and we want to steal and we want to take, and everyone here knows that that's not necessarily the truth. But how did we get here? Right? We need to ask ourselves, how do we get to a point where people are walking into churches, they're walking into synagogues, killing people for, because they believe a reality that doesn't exist. How are bad ideas so corrosive? Well, first and foremost, we have a president that lies pathologically, right? He is the conspiracy theorist in chief. In 2014, I was hired to be a political science adjunct professor, and I say to the head of the department, has anybody ever asked you about conspiracy theories? And he laughed at me, and I said, oh, and I grabbed my stuff and I ran out, right? 2 years later, Trump is president, and he's the biggest conspiracy theorist there is. What was it a month or two ago, talking about white genocide in South Africa? And we know for a fact that is not the case, but that doesn't stop him from going up there and using his platform to spread misinformation, okay? He's also aided by various media outlets, most prominently Fox News and Breitbart, and they're going to parrot everything he says, right? And he's also supported by a Republican Party that'll say anything or do anything to stay in power. Everything he's guilty of doing, they're guilty of doing. All the fear-mongering, all the lies, they're just as guilty as he is. And on top of all that, on top of everything, okay, we have a corporate-funded Democratic Party that has a lot in common with the same GOP. That's not afraid to use lies or misinformation to solidify the status quo. So there is this polluting of the discourse, and there's really no system to check it, right? The opposition party is almost in lockstep with the party in power. But that's why, again, taking a side note, that's why New Jersey Revolution Radio is important. Because if somebody doesn't step up and act as a watchdog, it's just not going to happen, right? These people are not going to watch themselves. We're going to ask ourselves then, really quick, let me just say this. It's great that Trump is now getting called out for lying by media outlets. I saw I can't remember what it was, but somebody was, I think it was PolitiFact or whoever was tweeting, was fact-checking Trump as he was talking, and that's a good thing, right? I don't want to jump on them for doing that, but the damage has pretty much already been done. Donald Trump is already president, okay? This is the same media that gave him billions, and that's billions with a B, and free publicity for his campaign, right? They didn't do anything to check him. They didn't fact-check him when it mattered. Now that he's president and it's the hip thing to do, everybody's jumping on board. See, now this is what brings us to the crux of this presentation today. The problem is that democracies depend on trust and shared sources of knowledge, right? A modern democracy, a modern society, any society really depends on shared knowledge. Much of what we understand the world is based on the testimony of other people rather than firsthand experience. For example, I've never been to Paraguay. I've never actually met anybody from Paraguay, but I know Paraguay is real. Why? Because there's pictures, there's testimonies, there's animal life, there's plant life, there's geological formations, right? We know that these things are real. Conspiracy theorists want us to start to chip away at this public trust. And that's incredibly problematic. Really quick, has anybody here ever heard the conspiracy theory that Australia isn't real? Right? Like, we laugh about that, and it's probably only a handful of people that believe that. But it is a destructive idea, and there are people who believe things far worse than this myth that Australia isn't real. Shared knowledge holds societies together, whether or not it's the United States in 2019 or whether it's the Stone Age. Conspiracy theories ask us to give up more and more of our trust in one another. And that's a big problem. Our institutions of knowledge are incredibly important, right? Schools, progressive think tanks, these are institutions that matter. Scientists of all stripes, historians, political scientists, engineers, people with all kinds of credentials are very often written off by conspiracy theorists. Just look at the struggle going on nationally over what gets published in textbooks, right? Look at what's the fight that's going on in Texas, a lot of the fights going on in the Bible Belt, right? You have historians, you have geologists, you have virologists, scientists from all kinds of fields of disciplines telling you about climate change, trying to, or historians trying to talk to you about the reality of history, and because it doesn't fit with someone's preconceived idea of history, they want to challenge that and they want to rewrite history books. And that of course, is unacceptable. Social movements like Black Lives Matter and Me Too, these are organizations and movements that reflect severe social ills. Okay? These are all met with misguided skepticism. Similar to the shooter of the Tree of Life Synagogue, there's this idea that there's this shadowy group of puppet masters pulling the strings. And for the Tree of Life murderer, and I won't say his name, right? He believed that it was Jews. He believed that there was secretly that there were these Jews, and as I said, they were directing and paying off Central Americans to come here. I don't know, mothers with children were going to take over the country and defeat the U.S. military. But again, it's this idea. One of the major ways that these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories are still perpetuated is because of the Democratic donor George Soros. Has anybody ever heard of George Soros? Has anybody gotten their check from Soros lately? Because I feel like Brian's holding him off.
He's
really
late.
I feel like you're hoarding him, Brian.
Really late.
Right? George,
knows me plenty.
right? Really quick about George Soros. George Soros is a Jew. As a child, he survived Nazi-occupied Hungary. Today, the far right labels him a Nazi collaborator, and he's actually called a Nazi. Donald Trump Jr. and Roseanne Barr actually retweeted that George Soros was a Nazi, and that's unfortunate. My wife is Jewish. She's a Holocaust educator. I don't like George Soros, but to call a Jew who survived the Hungarian occupation a Nazi is incredibly insulting, and it's just tasteless. George Soros is just a neoliberal donor. Okay, he's not some pedophile madman. I mean, I don't think he's like performing satanic rituals. I wouldn't assume. He's just another face of the status quo. He is the custodian of the status quo, right? So you think of the terrible things that were said about Barack Obama, terrible things that were said about Hillary Clinton. Again, not the biggest fans of those two. And honestly, I kind of wish Hillary Clinton was half as evil as the far right says she was, because at least we'd probably get some decent health care and cheaper education. But she's not, right? Hillary Clinton's the same person who gave the same speech, or gave a different speech to Wall Street than when she was trying to play progressive. And we know the reality, right? But to them, in their world, she is going to bring on the second coming of the Stalinist terror. I don't even know how that happens, and I'm still trying to figure that out, right? Conspiracism breeds cynicism. This idea, this belief in conspiracy theories, it breeds cynicism. Again, let's look at New Jersey Revolution Radio. You got Brian on Heather. Brian could be on a megaphone leading a rally. Heather helps put together all these events. You got Diane, who's going door to door canvassing for the Green Party. Real people doing real work, real activism. A conspiracy theorist, somebody who believes in Illuminati theory, or this idea, again, that there's this shattered group of people running everything, would just look at the work that Brian's doing, or Heather's doing, or Diane's doing, and say, well, they're just being paid off. They're just pawns. They're being played with. They're toys. Or Brian is in reality getting these Soros checks, and he's eventually going to make himself the Stalin of New Jersey. I don't know. You can't really follow the logic. It's not too far off. I mean, you don't have a mustache and you got long hair, so it's not really the same thing. Again, you look at an organization that's doing good things. It could be New Jersey Revolution Radio, as I said. It could be Black Lives Matter. It can be the Me Too. And a conspiracy theorist would just say, oh no, it's just the Jews controlling everybody. Right? If you are a true progressive, if you truly care about humanity and human liberation, you are not gonna block the masses when they come together, when they start working. That's something that should be celebrated, not something that should be fought. It's something people need to come together. Thank you. To the right, somebody like Brian getting out there, pouring his heart out. He's just a pawn, and he's just a pawn of Soros, right? Or what the globalists are doing. Side note, whenever you hear globalist, that's code word for Jew, right? Whenever you hear globalist, whenever you hear banker, and whenever you hear like reptile people, Rothschild, anytime you hear that, all somebody did was they took an old conspiracy theory, they took the word Jew, they erased the word Jew, and they just put something else. And well, it's not Jews, it's reptile people, aliens. Sorry, Heather. It's the bankers, it's the globalists. And you can look, again, read Hofstadter, you can look me up, I'll get you some resources. It's the same tropes and themes repeating themselves over and over and over. So I want to give you a red flag to look out for, a little side note here, be it 9/11, be it the moon landings, be it the 2018 pipe bomb attacks. There are certain phrases you're going to want to look out for. One is the official story. Okay? The other one is the government's version of events. Now, you're going to hear these phrases used a lot in all kinds of conspiracy theories, but realistically, no one ever says it's the official story that dinosaurs lived millions of years ago, or it's the official story that George Washington was the first president after the Constitution. No, that's the standard model of history. It's the standard model that dinosaurs lived millions of years ago. Now, I don't have full faith in the government and what they tell me, no, but when the government comes to the same conclusion as everybody else, maybe it's time to start moving on and to stop freaking out about chemtrails or whatever it is. Conspiracy theories are used by demagogues. We could look at our president. We could look at the rise of the far right. We could look at what the GOP is slowly, I don't even want to say slowly becoming, what they have become. Conspiracy theories are used by demagogues who often scapegoat powerless communities, right? That's the whole thing. We're going to go after people who don't have power. We're going to go after people who can't fight back, right? A woman coming across the border with her child without any money and a formal education, she's not a threat to the status quo. She wants to feed her kid and put a roof over her head. She's not some militant from another country trying to impose Stalinism, right? But when these conspiracy theories center on Jewish people, people of color, LGBT people, immigrants, all they do is they just worsen this environment of fear, and they make racism worse. Antisemitism, Islamophobia, xenophobia, homophobia, and all these other forms of prejudice and bigotry and oppression, they all tend to flourish. And we can see what's happening now. Look at what happened in the immediate aftermath of Trump's election. Look at what's going to happen in Brazil. Look at what's already happening in Brazil. 6 months from now, let's ask ourselves about the black population, the Indian population, the LGBT community in Brazil. Let's revisit what's going on in Brazil, right? We want to talk about actual threats to liberation and power. Let's look at that. We don't want to blame migrants coming from from desperate situations. But whenever Donald Trump or Alex Jones, or Tucker Carlson, or Michael Savage, or Fox and Friends, or anybody on the right wing, whenever they start, say, Latinos or criminals, whenever they say that they're going to steal something, people believe them, right? There is a direct correlation between what these people say on these platforms and the actions taken by their followers. When people from the Middle East are said to be un-American or some kind of Trojan horse, just like that Congresswoman Tlaib, there was a freak out. There was some, always from the Bible Belt, some evangelist who was freaking out, calling her the Trojan horse, right? There's 1 million Muslims in this country. That's 1/3 of 1%, less than 1/3 of 1% of this population, and they're going to take over everything. There's not even rationality behind that. But again, these are the types of arguments that you have to try to make when talking to these people. Trans individuals can't just go to the bathroom without being hounded and without being ridiculed, right? There are consequences when these people get up on these platforms and they say hateful things. These communities are targeted, and these are real problems that they're facing. Tomorrow, right? There was supposed to be that rally with those white supremacists. Thankfully, they backed out, right? That's a good thing. But did everybody read the letter that they wrote? They had to take their little dig to all you limousine liberals and so on. I didn't know you were a limousine liberal, Brian.
Yes.
God, where
Was that your limo out there? It wasn't a stretch, though, right?
Yes.
Yeah. But again, they reference Jewish supremacists. What does it even mean? They never actually named. It'll be Soros and then Rothschild. Rothschilds don't have power anymore. They haven't had power in 50, 60 years. And even then, that power was dispersed. Okay? But I'm wrapping it up. Conspiracy theories are as American as apple pie. Okay? They're believed by all types of people from all kinds of backgrounds. Rich, poor, black, white, it doesn't matter. From the Salem witch trials to Pizzagate, there's never been a time in American history where there wasn't some popularly held belief that some group of others were being targeted. But this is why we need to be vigilant. We need to respect our scientists. We need to respect our historians. We need to respect our educators. When women, when people of color, when immigrants, when disabled people tell us that they're facing barriers, that they're facing obstruction, right? Our knee-jerk reaction shouldn't be that they're lying or that they're pawns of some nefarious, puppet master. We need to listen to people. What we believe matters, and where we get our information from matters. Thank you. Woo. So if anybody's interested, my name is Christian Perez. I'm the host of Modernity and Absurdity podcast. I released 2 episodes this week. Brian was going to murder me if I didn't do it. You can email me at perezpodcast@gmail.com. And as always, available iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, New Jersey Revolution Radio. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Great job. Thank you.
All right.
So,
I gotta check.
oh, sure, no problem. So while we set up for our next panel here, I'll just remind everybody that's in the room, as well as you at home, that New Jersey Revolution Radio is working with One People's Project to combat hate here.